It's a special double episode, spring football preview, and this little event going on in San Antonio. What's it called? The Final Four. We'll talk about that too next on Michigan Podcast.
But there's going to be one team that's going to play solely as a team. No man is more important than the team. No coach is more important than the team. The team, the team, the team.
Looks deeper in the corner. Waits for it. Yes, caught.
This is no time for that. In the pocket and a sack. Tim Jamison. Brady gets terrific.
Throws it and a touchdown. Knight again.
Schultz just before Brazil got him. And a leaping interception by Woodson.
Harbaugh back to throw over the middle. Caught by Collier at the 5 on his feet. Touchdown, Michigan. On its way. It's good.
He's 5'7", 179 pounds, a junior at Michigan. But Jamie Morris hacks a wallop, and he delivers for Bo Schembechler.
And here's your first play. Pressure coming. Sack. It is Glenn Steele, number 81, who fought his way through the traffic.
Option. And Robinson calls his own number, and he's going to score. Oh, an easy touchdown for Robinson and Michigan.
We'll win it. We're going to win the championship again because we're going to play as a team. And when we play as a team, and the old season is over, you and I know it's going to be Michigan again. Michigan.
Go Blue, I'm Steve Deace. We have a jam-packed edition, so let's get to it this week on Michigan Podcast. We're going to have a ton on the Final Four, the college basketball landscape. We're going to show you some data that's going to really prove what an insane job John Belein has done moving Michigan back to the college basketball elite. That's coming up a little bit later on, as well as our weekly visit with our good friend Michael Spath from WTKA. But we're going to begin by talking spring football. The Wolverines get underway this week to make preparations for what I think is a huge, pivotal, crucial 2018 season that's going to tell us a lot about the current trajectory of the program. Prior to spring practice getting underway, Coach Jim Harbaugh gave a really in-depth interview with Sam Webb of WTKA. I'd urge you to go on Sam's website and listen to that for yourself. There were 7 huge data points that I took out of that interview that I wanted us to discuss here to open up this week's episode of Michigan Podcast one by one. Let's start with this one. Coach Harbaugh seemed very high on his new coaches, both in their energy level and also what Ben Herbert adds when it comes to strength and conditioning. Now, let me start with that latter point first. I have no doubt Ben Herbert is adding a lot at strength and conditioning, but if there's any subject we have sadly become experts on as Michigan football fans in recent years, it's coaching changes and staffing changes. No one ever hires a new strength and conditioning coach and comes out and says, I got to tell you, man, these guys just letting these guys just turn into lazy bums, man. Guys are getting chubby, fat. They're lifting less. No one does that, guys. No one ever shows up on signing day and says, I just want y'all to know. Truth be told, this class is getting my ass fired 3 years max. No one does that. Everybody signed every kid they wanted. Everybody's class is great. Okay, and we're still going to make 25 to 30 coaching changes in college football this December, despite the fact you lied to us, you signed a great recruiting class. Okay, and no one ever says, man, our new strength and conditioning coach just making these guys softer. Nobody ever does that. All right, so that's great news about Ben Herbert. We heard that about Kevin Torbert. when he took over originally, when Harbaugh came in 2015 as well. And most strength and conditioning coaches are good at their jobs. Most of them have a new approach or a new style and pay some dividends. You shake things up in year one. The true test of what Ben Herbert brings from a strength and conditioning standpoint, just as it was with his predecessor, is going to come 3-4 years down the road. So I'm going to kind of dismiss that part. I am interested, though, in what Harbaugh thinks when it comes to position coaches, particularly Jim McElwain at wide receivers and Ed Warner at offensive line, because those are the two positions. I think there's plenty of talent at quarterback with or without Shea Patterson. I just think if Shea Patterson is eligible, he's ready to go right now. And if not, then there's more development to do with the other guys. But the position groups that are going to determine whether this offense takes the next step or not are the ones coached by Ed Warner and Jim McElwain. And those are the offensive linemen, particularly the tackles, and the wide receivers. So those are the positions to keep an eye on throughout the course of the spring. Harbaugh made it clear, speaking of the wide receiver coaching, that was a position that needed an upgrade. He was very specific talking about that. In fact, one of the things, if you go listen to this Harbaugh interview with Sam Webb at WTKA for yourself, I think you're going to be stunned at how forthright transparent he is. Because a lot of what we see out of Jim Harbaugh nowadays is a lot of this. Yes. No. I don't think so. That's a lot of what we get. A lot of blank stares. A lot of nothing burgers, a lot of single, double word answers, a lot of benign cliches, which is funny if you go listen to the podcast that him and his dad does every week. I mean, totally different coach. And you get to hear some of that in the interview that he gave with Sam Webb. And he was very specific in why wide receiver coaching needed an upgrade. And if we watched our wide receivers all year long, and I know people like to say, well, Steve, Tariq Black got hurt early in the year. Stop and think about this, though. We're also saying a guy who was a true freshman who wasn't even the most highly touted freshman coming into this past season. We're saying that entire position group hinged on the performance of a true freshman. I mean, wide receiver is a position that traditionally receivers don't contribute a lot to as freshmen. So where was Kekoa Crawford? Why are we running fades to Eddie McDoom? You know, why did Grant Perry just disappear at the end of the year, right? Those are guys that have some experience. And Jim points out, hey, those guys were not performing the way they should, and we needed an upgrade coaching that wide receiver position. Point number 3 that Jim made in the Sam Webb interview, that Jim owned up to some coaching errors in his self-scouting of the offensive side of the football and admitted, you know, it was, quote, uncomfortable to look in the mirror. And here Harbaugh is really transparent and was brutally honest about mistakes that he made and his coaches made developing the offensive side of the football. And I think we needed to hear this as fans. And it's not as important that we hear this as, you know, the players see a different approach. But let's face it, man, a lot of the buzz around our football program isn't there right now. I mean, we had some buzz in January. It was bad buzz. All right. That was a bad buzz. And there's more trepidation than excitement about this season. And I think it is refreshing to hear our coach, who we know doesn't lack for confidence, right? So this isn't the humble brag or, you know, we're not looking for Jimmy to become a life coach here. All right. But it's nice for us to hear as fans that coach recognizes what went on last season just wasn't acceptable. And no, we don't want to win more than he does, right? I think that's obvious. But I think it's important for him to share with us. This is a relationship between the fans and the team. And I think it's important for the coach to share with us, not necessarily a Bill Clinton, I'll feel your pain, but I think it is good for him to show a little transparency and empathy, because that also helps us as fans to be more empathetic with him as a coach as well. Next point I wanted us to talk about from the Sam Webb interview with Coach Harbaugh at the start of spring practice. Harbaugh noted, again, pointing the finger at himself, that he did a poor job preparing the quarterbacks for the fall. And just to show that that wasn't, you know, a talking point, he's not just throwing it out there, he gave something very specific with Sam Webb. In fact, he went all the way back to the season opener against Florida, which was probably the highlight of the entire season there in week 1 when you think about it. And he noted Wilton Spate's 2 interceptions, those 2 pick sixes that he threw in the second quarter when we had the lead in the first half of the game. And he said he knew right then and there as a coach that he had not done a good job getting his quarterbacks prepared for the season, because he figured, hey, we play cover 0 or cover 1 against Don Brown's aggressive defense all summer long, so our guys are ready to throw into tight windows. But, most teams in college football don't play that as their base defense. Most teams in college football play cover 2, cover 3, trying to mix up their coverages. And that's what we saw the first game against Florida, Jim said. And we didn't practice that all year long. And when you had the turnover that we had on our team, guys weren't available in terms of timing. The angles of where I sit down in that zone defense and, the windows that quarterbacks have to throw to. I mean, it was just really specific in pointing out errors that they made, and specifically he made as a head coach last year. And again, I thought that was refreshing, and I think and hope it's a good sign for this fall. Next point that Jim made is that the quarterback competition is fierce, and he was also quick to single out freshman Joe Milton, who the Michigan coaches have let it be known. They are very high on him and his future, the kid out of Florida who came in as a 4-star and they think was still underrated. But they have noticed that the competition in that room, nobody's giving away on anything, and that's good. One thing we didn't have a lot of last year was competition at quarterback, because we kind of had to play the guy that was healthy. Because we had rotisserie quarterbacks starting 3. It's the first time Michigan started 3 different quarterbacks since 1984. And that season was 6-6, and this season was 8-5, and it felt like 6-6, and that's what happens when you have to play your third-string quarterback. Next point Jim made in the Sam Webb interview: redshirt freshman offensive tackles James Hudson and Chuck Filiaga are, quote, coming hard, right? So that's a Harbaugh-ism. You're not quite an ascending player. That's one of Jim's favorite terms. If you're coming hard, that's like you're on the bubble. See, we're still in March Madness, right? So you're not in the tournament yet. If you're an ascending player in Jim Harbaugh's lexicon, that means you got a bid, all right? The selection committee puts you in. If we're using March Madness translators here for Harbaugh-isms, coming hard means you're on the bubble. Well, we need those guys to become ascending players, because they may be, along with Shea Patterson, 2 of the 4 or 5 most important players in this program. At least one of them has to be ready to contribute huge this fall, because we don't want to have to move Ben Bredesen, who's probably our best interior lineman when you look at the combination of talent and experience. I don't think his ceiling's as high as Cesar Ruiz's, for example, or even maybe Michael Onwenu's. But when you look at his experience and talent, we want to have him playing inside. We've done enough of moving guards around. We need some real tackles. The player that Grant Newsome looked like he was going to be before the injury, the players we grew up on, the John Jansons, the Greg Skrepaneks, the Trezell Jenkins, the guys who just sit out there on an island on the outside and they look like mountains, not men. We haven't had that. We've been having to be makeshift with Mason Cole and others. Really, we haven't had that since Taylor Lewan. And we need one of those guys to become one of those kinds of tackles for Michigan this year. Which brings us to the final point. Harbaugh admitted that he changed his sideline demeanor on purpose in response to new rules about coaching behavior. In fact, if you go back and listen to this interview with Sam Webb, what you're going to come to the conclusion of is that people that are keen observers and close observers of the program, not trolls, but people that are close to the program or devoted followers of Michigan football, several of the critiques that they posted on Michigan message boards this fall had merit, including this one. A lot of people wondering, hey, where's fiery Jimmy on the sidelines, particularly with such a young team? Your leaders aren't really established yet. You kind of need that leadership more from your coaches. And Jim looked like he was on tranquilizer darts most Saturdays. And he admitted, Sam Webb asked him about that. He said, hey, I did that in response to these new rules cracking down on coaching behavior in college football. I think he went too far. I think there's a happy medium there somewhere. And I hope Jim finds it this fall, because I want to see I want to see Jimmy again setting the tempo with that fire and brimstone and that legendary competitiveness, more so than blank stares, deer in the headlights, and that on Quaaludes motif we saw too often this fall. I think fiery Jim, it doesn't have to be reckless with it, but a fiery Jim returning would be a welcome return. Back here on Michigan Podcast, and there's a look at our Patreon page. And if you stop right there for just a second, you'll notice that while we were off last week, I put together a podcast, 4 weeks till Selection Sunday, where Michigan basketball stands. And that kind of was able to tide you over while we took a 1 week hiatus since signing day. And if you're one of the folks that is supporting us on Patreon, you got to take advantage of that. You got to listen to that. And we greatly appreciate your support. I know a lot of you ask us, hey, what can we do to get more content from you guys? Well, keep in mind, we are taking time away from the stuff that actually feeds our families to put this together as a labor of love every single week. And so if there is a group of you out there that says, hey, we really support what you're doing, we want more of it, this is one surefire way to get us to open up more of our schedule to produce even more content. And plus, if you're a Patreon supporter, you get access to exclusive content separate from what we put out here for free on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, and YouTube every week as well. So check us out. Check us out at patreon.com/Michigan Podcast.
Gene, it's been a good ride, but it's over Saturday. Go Blue, 100.
That's former Michigan great Jalen Rose's 100-year-old grandmother dropping some knowledge, giving the 411 to Sister Jean of Loyola of Chicago, who has become a national phenomenon, a force of nature. I think she set the record, according to Guinness, most bobbleheads ever sold in one day this week. But Jalen Rose's 100-year-old grandmama is like, hey, it was fun while it lasted, but reality check is coming on Saturday. Let's hope she's right about that as the Wolverines get set now for their 8th Final Four, their second one in 5 years under John Belein. And we're going to have plenty of analysis about this game in particular when Michael Spath joins us from WTKA in the next segment. But I wanted us to take a big picture look at really what Michigan basketball has accomplished. So over the weekend, I went back and took a look at who are the best programs in college basketball and how would we measure that. All right, so here's the metric that I use to determine the top 25 programs in college football. I went back to 1979, and I did so for 3 reasons. One, it was the first year that all teams in the NCAA tournament were fully seeded. All right. Also, that was the Magic versus Bird NCAA final. That year is considered the game that vaulted college basketball into sports prominence. And also 40 years is a good measuring stick. You get a good trend line there. It doesn't have too much recency bias, but it also doesn't overemphasize historic data that no longer applies. All right. So if you go back, because counting this NCAA tournament, it would be 40 tournaments. Here's the way I awarded points. I gave 10 points for a national championship season, 8 points if you finished as a national runner-up, 7 points if you finished in the Final Four, 5 points if you won a conference title, season or tournament, 4 points if you had the National Player of the Year or the #1 overall NBA draft pick, 3 points if you had a 30-win season, 2 points if you had a 25-win season, and then you got 1 point if you were an NCAA tournament team that year. All right, and that's all that you did. You didn't get any further than that. Here are the top 25 programs in the country when you added up these total points over the last 40 years. What you can see right away is there's 4 blue bloods that are way ahead of everybody else. Kentucky, North Carolina, Duke, and Kansas. I don't think that shocks anybody to see those numbers, okay? Then you look and you see there's another tier of elite programs. Louisville, their score might be a little higher than people think. Gonzaga, now they've got a star, an asterisk by their name. What does that mean? I'll explain that in a second. Arizona, Michigan State comes in as the top Big Ten team. UNLV, people forget how great they once were during this time. UConn, which has won multiple NCAA tournaments. Syracuse, Memphis, and Cincinnati may surprise some teams why they're that high. And it goes to how many conference titles in 25 and 31 seasons they've had. And then UCLA. The rest of the top 25 programs: Xavier, which gets a double asterisk, I'll explain in a second, Georgetown, Oklahoma, Villanova, Ohio State, Arkansas, Indiana, Florida, Butler, and then at the bottom of the top 25, Michigan is number 24 with 121 points up until the Final Four. Now, the first asterisks were teams that haven't won a national championship during this time period. The double asterisks is haven't been to a Final Four during this time period. There's only one team that hasn't been to either a Final Four or a national championship, and that's Xavier. And that tells you how many championships they've won in the regular season and conference tournaments. And then you see only 8 of the teams on this list haven't won a national title. I mentioned Xavier's the only team that's never even made it to the Final Four. Now look at this stat. Everybody talks about the parity in college basketball, and there is to a point. But the top 5 teams on this list have combined for 51 of the 160 Final Four spots since '79. That's almost one-third. Almost one-third of all the Final Four berths the past 40 years have gone to those top 5 teams: Kentucky, North Carolina, Duke, Kansas, and Louisville. That's astounding. These top 25 teams have accounted for 119 of the 160 Final Four slots since 1979, so that's 46%, almost half. These top 5 teams on this list have combined for 18 of the last 40 national championships, pending what happens this year. Again, that's almost half of the national titles since 1979 have been won by Kentucky, North Carolina, Duke, Kansas, or Louisville. A couple of other data points that come up from this study. Unless Loyola wins the national title next week, 38 of the last 40 national champions would have come from 17 of these top 25 teams over the last 40 years. If you do the math on that, 4% of the teams in Division I college basketball have won 95% of the national championships in a single elimination tournament over the last 40 years. 4% have won 95% of the national championships. That shows you the select company John Belein is attempting to break back into. And if you put more of a finer point on it, here's a side note on Michigan. 22 of the 121 points Michigan has to rank as the 24th best program of the last 40 years. Well, 22 of those 121 points have come from this season and last season. That's almost 20% of all Michigan's points the last 4 years have come from the last 2 years. In fact, if you go back to 2012, because since 2012, Michigan has a Big Ten championship, a national runner-up, and then another Big Ten championship, and then another Big Ten championship, and then this year's Big Ten championship and a Final Four. So that's what Michigan's done the last 6 years. That would account for 44 of Michigan's 121 points have come since 2012, which is 36%. 36% of Michigan's accomplishments, more than one-third of the Wolverines' accomplishments in men's basketball over the last 40 years. How many of you watching this are 40 years old, by the way? Over one-third of Michigan's accomplishments in basketball over the last 40 years have come in just the last 6 seasons under John Belein. Truly an amazing job.
So the pass is going to come from Livers. He rifles it right in front of us to Abdul-Rahman at midcourt. Extra pass.
And it goes for the win. The three-pointer by Jordan Poole. A freshman has won it for the Wolverines.
The ball is hit. There you are. You're running for your life. You're a shooting star, and all the years no one knows just how hard you worked, but now it shows. In one shining moment you reached inside. One shining moment you knew you were alive. Feel the beat of your heart, feel the wind in your face. It's more than a contest, it's more than a race. One shining moment you knew, one shining moment you were willing to try. One shining moment you knew. One shining moment.
Back here on our special double episode this week of Michigan Podcast, talking both spring football and the Final Four. And we're joined now by Michael Spath from WTKA in Ann Arbor. Good to see you, Michael.
Hey, good to be here, guys. I got to say, I'm having a blast this week. And what a fun time it is to be a Michigan fan, right? I mean, not just the basketball, but the hockey. And I know a lot of people talk about, gymnastics and baseball over the weekend too. But certainly the emotion of following basketball and hockey, for me anyway, and I'm not trying to be sexist or be like big sports power three, big three sports, but certainly their success trumps everything else. And it's been a great ride these last couple of weeks. I'm having a blast. I'm sure you guys are having a blast too.
No doubt about it. I know people, and there are some people in our industry who thrive on controversy, contrived or otherwise, and sometimes we have to discuss those things. But I've always found, I started out doing a daily sports show like yours. I always found when the local teams are doing well, it's a lot more fun. That it just, when you're in those lost seasons, the Tigers getting ready to start this week, and you already know the season's going to suck. It drains you after a while. You can only do fire the coach so often, and everybody just ends up hating each other.
Well, I would agree. I mean, look at this Michigan football season going 8-5, and by the time that they were losing towards the end, I mean, the first time that they lose, that the conversations are going to flow during the week of sports talk radio. The second time that they lose, that the conversation is going to flow. By the time that they lose to Ohio State, you're kind of getting sick of it. You're like, all right, exactly. What are we going to say? I'm not going to say fire the coaches, but I'm tired of talking about the negativity. I'm tired of talking about what's going wrong with this program. I'd much rather talk about the exciting things that are going right. And then when they lost to the Outback Bowl, I mean, you and I walked down that path together, and it was it certainly was a dark, stormy road that I think, we were looking for the light at the end of the tunnel. We just didn't know that the light at the end of the tunnel was going to come from John Belein's team and from Mel Pearson's team.
Indeed. Those days in January were sackcloth and ashes, but now there is a light shining in the darkness, brother, and it is Michigan on its way to the Final Four. Let's break down how we got here in this matchup with Loyola of Chicago. I've got a series of data points I'm going to run by you, Michael, and I want to get your reaction to each and every one of them, okay? So let's start with this one. In a season with the sport faced with really criminal conspiracies, corruption, how about the fact the first two teams to get into the Final Four are coached by the guy voted the most ethical by his peers, and a Cinderella Catholic school who has this nun, 98-years-old nun, who has just captivated the country. I think she set a world record yesterday for most bobbleheads sold in one day. What do you think it means those were the first two teams in the Final Four, given what most of the conversation about this sport has been leading up to the Final Four?
I think it's a great reminder that you can be successful in college basketball without having to cheat. I don't know that the other two programs on the other side of the bracket are cheaters. I certainly have always felt pretty good about Villanova. I think Kansas is probably one of those gray area type of teams, along with Kentucky and Duke and Michigan State and Ohio State and North Carolina. But I think overall you're looking at a basketball tournament that you needed to have happen after the FBI reports came out in late February. You need to feel good about basketball. You needed some type of purity, and you're spot on. With Loyola Chicago, they're the team that everybody can cheer for because they're the mid-major. They're they do these things without the resources that everybody else has, without the athletes that that the top 5, top 10 programs in the country have. And then in Michigan, I mean, they can get access to those athletes, but they choose not to jump into the fray with a lot of them because they know what the bagmen, they know the AAU coaches, they know the guys that want to get paid. And so John Belein stays away from those guys. He builds his team another way. And I wonder if this is that moment, Steve, that we're all going to look back on. And it kind of reminds me a little bit of, say, the NFL, where the NFL became a league of parity, where anybody could win on any given day. And certainly the Patriots have done what they've done is incredible. But other than that, you really look at it in the last 10 to 15 years or so, there's been a lot of different Super Bowl winners. There's been a lot of different teams in the Super Bowl. It seems like anybody can win because they disperse the revenue. Now, it's a little bit different in basketball, but it's showing you that, again, if it reminds me, I know I just said football too, but maybe like 6 or 7 years ago, all those 12 seeds were beating the 5 seeds in the NCAA tournament. And why was that happening? That was happening because the 12 seeds were probably underseeded. You had these teams of mid-majors that had third and fourth year guys that were physically developed, that had played together, developed team chemistry. You didn't quite have that with the Kentuckys of the world that was recycling, rebuilding, reloading every single year, bringing in 5, 6, 7 new guys. And so you're able to figure out, like, hey, as talented as they are, if you play sound basketball, if you play with chemistry, if you play great defense, and because of the three-point shot, we can spread you out and take you out. I mean, I think those are the 2 examples that I think of that maybe we're reaching this point in college basketball where you don't need to have the one-and-dones. You don't need to go the Duke route that Mike Krzyzewski did. You don't need to go the Tom Izzo route where he started going after the Miles Bridges and Jaren Jacksons. Maybe you can run a program like Michigan has and be very successful. I think that'd be awesome if the next 10 years of college basketball follow the Michigan model as opposed to following the Duke model. Of course, though, if they do end up following John Belein's model, it's going to make it harder for John Belein to do what he's been doing.
Speaking of success, that brings us to our next data point. Michigan this season set a school record with 32 wins. And the previous 3 teams, Michael, to win at least 30 games in a Michigan uniform all played for the national championship.
Well, I mean, then I feel pretty good about playing on Monday night against Villanova or Kansas, I got to say. It's, to get to 30 wins, we shouldn't take that lightly. I mean, you have to have a really good regular season, and then you have to go on a run. And they've certainly been doing that. And this has been a lot of fun. This is a college basketball team that is peaking at the right time. I think everybody, and certainly we're biased, but I think most people, even the national pundits, expect Michigan to win this game. They are the more talented team. And if it was just being more talented, then I wouldn't say for sure that they're going to win this game because, Kentucky or Arizona or Tennessee, from who Loyola played, Tennessee or Miami or some of the teams that they played were probably more talented than them, but they might not have had the intangibles. They might not have had the great team chemistry. They might not have been as good defensively. And Michigan is all those things. And so when I look at it, I want to honestly kind of say that Michigan's going to win this game pretty easily. I think that'd be foolish of me to go out there, a little arrogant of me to go out there and say when this team is on such a great run that Michigan's just going to go out there and dismiss them, because I guarantee you that someone along the way was saying the exact same thing. But you know what? Kansas State is not Michigan, and Nevada's not Michigan, and Miami's not Michigan. Probably the closest team to Michigan so far has been Tennessee. That was a 1-point game. I really feel this is going to go Michigan's way, and they're going to set that school record for wins, and they've already had a great season, a great accomplishment, and they're well on their way to Monday night. And unfortunately, you and I won't speak again until after the national championship, but I truly feel like they can win this whole thing.
Let's talk about Michigan's path to the Final Four with our next data point we're going to take a look at now. And you look at it, Michigan joins 3 teams to make it to the Final Four without facing a top 5 seed since full seeding began in 1979. Duke in 1986 finished second, while Kansas in 2008 and UConn in 2004 ended up winning the national title, Michael.
Well, it's certainly been, when you talk about on paper, the teams that they have faced have been, easier than, say, what Kansas had to go through. Kansas had to beat Duke. They had to beat 4-seeded Clemson. They had to beat a good 9-seed team. So, I mean, in some ways, Michigan, you can't dispute that they've had, on paper, again, easier time. That said, I mean, I said this earlier this week on my show. I mean, they played a Houston team that was as hot as any team in the country. And I know it was only one game, but the talk of the first round was Rob Gray. and they shut him down. And then they played a Texas A&M team that, frankly, North Carolina was the pick to win the national championship for a lot of teams, and Texas A&M went in there and curb stomped North Carolina. And so Michigan had to play that team who's hot, who has athleticism, who can run, who's got shot blockers, and Michigan beat them by 27 points. And then they had to play a Florida State team that had knocked off a 1 in Xavier, had knocked off a 4 in Gonzaga, was also lean and athletic, was also playing with house money. And Michigan, for the most part, it was a tight game, but they were up by 10 with 2 minutes to go. They're probably more in command than we really felt like towards the end of the game. So they've beaten the teams in front of them. I've dismissed this talk, frankly. I've dismissed this talk that they've had an easy road. Have they had an easier road than Kansas? Sure. Have they had an easier road than Villanova? Yeah, but they've got to beat the teams in front of them. The fact of the matter is that every team that they've played so far, starting with Montana had just won the Big Sky. And so this is a team coming in with a lot of excitement, a lot of momentum. Then they played a Houston team that had won their previous game. Then they played a Texas A&M team that had won their 2 previous games. Then they played a Florida State team that had won their 3 previous games. Every step along the way, they've had to play a team that's playing its best basketball of the year. You can only beat the team in front of you. Michigan has done that, so I could care less what the seeds are of the teams that they've played so far.
Well, you've already preemptively answered this next data point, but let's take a look at it anyway. If Michigan beats Loyola on Saturday, Michigan will be the first team ever to make it to the national championship game without beating a top 5 seed to get there. That's never happened before, but as you've noted, these teams, this bracket, you can say it opened up, but Michigan had to then play the teams that opened up the bracket. You go back to Houston. Ken Palm actually rated them the highest of all the number 6 seeds. Ken Palm had them 17th in the country heading into the NCAA tournament. And yeah, they got to play Texas A&M instead of North Carolina, but we saw Texas A&M, as you said, curb stomp North Carolina the game before. And yes, they got to play Florida State instead of Gonzaga, but we got to see Florida State just defeat Gonzaga the game before. So it wasn't like there were these upsets on one half of the bracket and Michigan just kind of landed here. And they had to play the hot teams that had just pulled off those upsets that opened up the bracket. That's a point that I think is getting lost here.
Well, I'll say this, Steve. When we get to Monday night, if Michigan beats Loyola and plays the national championship and they beat Villanova or they beat Kansas, and the last time I checked Ken Palm, both those teams were in the top 4 of Ken Palm. I think Villanova is number 2 behind Virginia. So if they go out there and win the national championship and beat Villanova, are we going to look back and say, well, they beat 5 teams that weren't higher than a 5 seed, and then they beat Villanova? No, we're going to look back and say they won a national championship, and they beat, arguably, in the final game, they beat the best team in college basketball for 2017-18, because I think you could make the case prior to the tournament, you might have said Virginia, but now factoring in the tournament, Villanova was the best team in college basketball. And so Michigan go out there, beat Loyola on Saturday, beat Villanova, and this talk it has to go away. If I'm listening to a certain radio show host in Detroit after Monday's show talking about how it was the easiest or how it was, it diminishes Michigan's success this year, I'm going to lose my mind. But I know that might be coming because that's what he likes to do. But no, I don't think you can take anything away from Michigan right now. And for every team, and I said this on Twitter over the weekend, for any team that is diminishing Michigan, that is saying, well, they didn't have as hard of a road, where's your team right now? Because there's only 3 other teams in the country that can talk some smack. Every other team, the other, 64 teams that participate in the NCAA tournament should shut the hell up.
Preach. And, you can talk about who Michigan beat, but also look at how they played. Take a look at this next data point about how impressive Michigan has been defensively so far. Michigan, so far in the NCAA tournament, Michael, has held Montana to its worst offensive efficiency outing of the season, Houston to its 4th worst, Florida State to its worst. The one team who didn't suffer a massive offensive efficiency collapse against Michigan was Texas A&M. And they still lost to the Wolverines by 27 points. So what does that tell you?
Well, not only that, I think the Texas A&M game is a little deceiving because they were down, 42-18 at one point. Really in the second half, what you saw Michigan play was a traditional bend but don't break defense, where they weren't going to give up a lot of the open 3-pointers. They let Texas A&M just kind of have the paint. Didn't really want to get in a position where they were fouling them so they could keep them from having an easy basket, they would, but otherwise they weren't going to contest those shots in the paint because they were like, look, we're up by 25 points. We're scoring at will. We don't need to put these guys in 3-point plays and give them some momentum. And so really, I think if the game would have been a little bit closer, I bet you Michigan would have held Texas A&M to one of their lowest defensive or one of their offensive performances of the year. What it says to me, honestly, Steve, is that's why I feel great about Michigan beating Loyola, and that's why I really like their chance to beat Villanova. Everybody's talking about how good Villanova is, but you know what? When you can play defense the way Michigan has, it's very reminiscent of, for me, Alabama for football. When you can play defense the way that Alabama football has under Nick Saban, you have a chance to take out any team that you play. That's what they did this past year in the college football playoff. That's what they've done for, 4 of his national titles. They've just had one of the best defenses in the country. Michigan has the best defense in the country remaining in this tournament, and I really you got to keep past Loyola because they do have that momentum. They might have God on their side. I don't buy that because I'm a Christian and you're a Christian, and guess what? We cheer for Michigan, so I think God might be on our side too. But they got to get past the Cinderella story. Once they do that, I really like their chance against Villanova because they play outstanding defensive basketball, and few teams are ready for the type of intensity for 40 minutes. And it starts with the man at the point guard spot, and the way that he defends you, the way that he defends your point guard, he makes it hard for you every single possession. He makes you have to work so incredibly hard to create an open opportunity for yourself, and the rest of the team just follows that. I don't know that someone can be ready for that until they're experiencing it in the first half of the game.
You want to talk about how Michigan's been playing. Let's even go beyond the NCAA tournament just to show, even if the bracket did open up, this is no fluke. Take a look at this data point. Michigan's 13-game winning streak has come entirely against teams that are ranked in KenPom's top 100 overall. 8 of those teams, Michael, were in KenPom's top 50. 11 of those 13 games were not at Chrysler Arena, and Michigan has won 9 of them by 9 points or more. So you can talk all you want about brackets opening up, and there's certainly some truth to that, but this has been a level of dominance that predated even the naming of this bracket.
Well, I'll tell you what, Steve, I don't know if I've seen you tweet that out, but if you haven't tweeted it out, please do. I'd love to retweet that because that should shut up any haters.
Yeah, hat tip to Drew Hallett actually had that data point, so I want to give him credit for that, yeah. Yeah,
absolutely. That's an incredible stat point to say that, 11 teams in the top 100 and all those teams away from, or 13 teams went to the top 100, all those teams away from Ann Arbor where it's hard to win. Now, I will say this when you talk about being away from Ann Arbor is New York City was essentially Ann Arbor, due. And what I've been told from people that were in Los Angeles that, my producer, Zach Shaw, was out there. He said that the arena held 19,000. And he thought, now this is probably hyperbole, but he thought that out of the 19,000, 15,000 were from Michigan. So, I mean, it's de facto home games playing in front of huge alumni bases. But the fact of the matter is you're still not home. The other team is at a neutral site also. So great stat from Drew. I appreciate you sharing that. I mean, here we are. Look, they're facing top 50 teams now. Loyola has moved way up. Villanova or Kansas is in the top 5. You know what? Beat the team in front of you. And if we get to Monday night and we're national champions, again, I am not going to care about those stats at all. No one's taking that banner down. This is not a Rick Pitino scandal. This is Michigan beating teams that are sitting in front of them, that are playing great basketball. And we're going to relish it for the rest of our lives.
All right, 4 more quick data points I want to run by you. Then I want to ask you quickly about spring football as well. Loyola is the 4th 11 seed to make it to the Final Four. The previous 3, LSU in '86, George Mason in '06, and VCU in 2011, all lost in the national semifinals, Michael.
Well, you know what? That, to me, that's sad. And what you think about this Loyola team is every game that Loyola's been in, they've been the underdog. And what it shows you is that to upset a team once, you can get it done. To upset a team twice, you can get it done. A couple of teams have been able to upset 4 of the opponents that they've faced. And now Loyola's obviously become the 4th team to do that. To upset a 5th team, to upset a 6th team, I mean, it's really, really hard to do. And I think what's going to help them, what's going to help Michigan, what's going to hurt Loyola, is that you've got this entire week. I know going to the Sweet 16, you had an entire week also. But if you were in Nevada going to that Sweet 16, you're kind of thinking like, okay, Loyola's run is over with. We're the favorite team. We'll be able to put it to, take them to it. Now here you are with Michigan, and you know how good this team is. You know what they've done. You're not going to take them lightly. I think everybody's probably taken Loyola a little bit lightly, maybe even Kansas State because they came off that great victory over Kentucky. Well, Michigan's not going to take them lightly. I think that's going to go a long way towards the outcome of this game on Saturday night.
Also about Loyola, take nothing away. This has been one of the greatest Cinderella runs in the history of the tournament. But they faced Miami of Florida, who didn't have their starting point guard. They faced Tennessee, who didn't have their best defensive player, their starting center. They faced Kansas State, whose leading scorer was out, only got re-injured in the second half against Kentucky and didn't play at the end of that game. So they've not played these power conference schools at full speed. Michigan has been very fortunate health-wise throughout the course of this season. Let's get to our next data point.
Man, I hope you were saying that with your fingers crossed right there, Steve.
Michigan is trying to become the first Big Ten team to win the NCAA tournament since 2000, Michael. Since 2002, the league has finished second in the NCAA tournament 6 times. That's more runner-up finishes than any other league over that time. Your thoughts?
Do you know who all those teams are? Obviously, Ohio State's one of them. Wisconsin's one of them. Michigan State is one of them.
Michigan is one of them. Yeah.
Michigan is one of them.
Yeah, I think Michigan State, are they in there? I think Maryland, no, Indiana in 2002.
Okay.
Indiana in 2002. Michigan State, I think the year it was in Detroit in 2009. Michigan in 2013. Yep. Wisconsin in 2015. And I think Ohio State to Florida in 2007, I think, were those teams. Yeah.
I mean, the Big Ten is due. I mean, it's certainly, we're talking about it a little bit like we were before Ohio State won a national championship in football. And whether or not it was all about the teams in the South and the SEC. And, you have to stay relevant. And certainly in basketball and football, the Big Ten is. But you have to stay relevant by winning championships. And for me, that would go a long way towards validating the Big Ten and the future of the conference in basketball. Because if you don't win championships, then you're always, the maid of honor. And I would like to see that drought end. I certainly think that Big Ten basketball, I mean, you can mention all you want. 6 teams have been to the national championship and lost. And maybe that's a show that the Big Ten is really good over the last 15 years. But at the end of the day, they don't have any championships. And so they've got to win it. And I tell you what, the last team to win it was Michigan State. And if Michigan can win the national championship on Monday, and you can take that away from the Spartans as who was the last Big Ten team to win a national championship, and now it's Michigan. I mean, we're going to talk about it on our show on Wednesday, but I really think that Michigan has wrestled the rivalry in basketball away to a greater extent than it's happened in football with Michigan State. Because you're talking about a juggernaut that hasn't gone away. You're talking about a head coach that hasn't gone away versus Michigan having its issues on the football side. This is an incredible run that John Belein's on, an incredible run that Michigan basketball is on. And to take it to our Sparty brethren, I absolutely love it. I'm sure you do too.
Well, one factor that may be a reason why Michigan has a decent chance to snap the Big Ten's championship drought, take a look at the defensive stats here. Michigan is the top defense remaining in the NCAA tournament, ranking 3rd in defensive efficiency, according to Ken Palm. Among the teams to make the Elite Eight, only Florida State at 33rd and Kansas at 46th did not rank 21st or higher in defensive efficiency.
Wow. I mean, I'm not even sure what to do with that. I mean, I think it bodes well for Michigan. If you can play great defense and you're going against teams that don't play great defense, and your offense has shown that if it can hit some shots, that it can really turn itself loose. Again, I think that bodes really well for the Wolverines on Saturday night. To me, it's obviously for all of us, it's going to come down to making some of those 3-pointers. They were, 4 of 21 against Florida State last weekend. I mean, that's not going to get it done. I'll say this: you're not going to beat Loyola Chicago if you only make 4 of your 3-pointers on Saturday night. I mean, even as good as they are defensively, even though they've shown other ways to win games, they're going to have to make some 3-pointers to beat Loyola. I think you need to have somewhere in the 8 to 10 range and playing more efficient basketball on the offensive side. But God, that's a great stat. You really brought your A game here today, Steve.
Well, I've got one more then. Hopefully we end on a high note here, Mr. Costanza. Michigan is 28-0 when Duncan Robinson scores at least 6 points. He had the big three that basically won the game against Florida State, the clinching free throws. And you go back to Michigan's 2013 team, Michael, their Final Four team was undefeated when Glenn Robinson III scored in double figures. Both of those guys, real X factors for Michigan teams. What is it about Duncan Robinson you think that makes him that X factor?
You know, Steve, I've got to be honest. I think this stat is kind of an anomaly. When you score 6 points, I mean, 6 points is not a lot. Like if you were to say like when he scores 12 points, Michigan is 6-0 or 26-0 or 28-0, I think it means more. I mean, 6 points, I think it's kind of like one of those funny stats that just keeps on working out that way.
You know why I think it matters though? Because of how he usually scores them. And I go back to
it. I agree with you that I agree with you that like he comes in and if he hits a couple of threes, it opens up the.
It's what Fran McCaffrey at Iowa says. I told my team if he makes the first one, we got to guard him the rest of the game, and that makes you defend Michigan differently the rest of the game because you have to defend Duncan Robinson the rest of the game. If he misses the first couple, he probably won't hit any, and it makes it easier to defend Michigan. We've seen that play itself out, haven't we, Michael? That's kind of how it goes.
Without a doubt, and that's probably with the 6 points. But I mean, like he could have scored against Florida State. Didn't he have 2 points on free throws, 2 points on a basket to the thing, and then he had two 3-pointers.
Yep. And
those 3-pointers, I believe one of them came pretty late in the game.
That was the one that made a 10-point game. Yep.
Yeah, so it's not like he scored hit a couple of those 3-pointers early in the game. It's exactly what you're talking about. I've heard the Fran McCaffrey quote. I agree with the Fran McCaffrey quote, but it wasn't like Duncan was going in there and lighting the world on fire in the first half, and all of a sudden like, okay, we've got to now adjust and guard him. And so I do think it is a little bit of a misleading stat, but I agree with you that he is an X factor because of the fact that he can make teams spread out a little bit. He keeps them honest. If you're going to defend Mo with a big 5 and you're going to say, okay, we're not going to go small ball against Michigan, then you've got to be able to defend Duncan and be able to get out on the perimeter and defend him out there. And so now you're in a position where one of these two guys is going to take a big away from the basket. And how are you going to do that? And I think the really underrated part of Duncan Robinson is you're probably aware too, is his defense has gotten so much better. He's gotten loose balls. Was it any surprise? I mean, yes, certainly it was a surprise Leonard Hamilton didn't foul for Florida State at the end of that game when they were down 4 with 11 minutes to go. But look who's the guy who had the loose ball, who got it in his hands, and that was Duncan Robinson. I think his ability to play the 4 in right now, especially with Isaiah Livers really struggling, his ability to do more than just hit 3-pointers, he is that X factor because he's giving you an unexpected contribution. And Rude's become expected, but coming off the bench to have that guy that you can't take a break. You take Isaiah Livers off the floor, you can't take a break with your guy that you're putting in there to guard Duncan Robinson. In fact, you almost have to put your best defender out there to guard Duncan Robinson, and that just changes the entire way that teams are defending Michigan.
Final thing, spring football, I don't think any of us would have thought we would have gotten to this point, and it would almost be an afterthought. I think most of us, not having any idea the basketball team would soar here and ascend the way that it has, most of us thought March would be for gripping about the football team and how pivotal of a season this is. Shea Patterson's eligibility, which as of the time that we are taping this, still has not yet been determined. What are the major storylines you're looking for heading into spring practice starting this week at Michigan, Michael?
You know what? I've got to be honest. Outside of the Shea Patterson being cleared by the NCAA to become eligible, I don't think there's a damn thing that I can hear during the spring ball that's going to get me excited for the football season. And that's not to be, a critic, or that's not to be a downer. But what could you possibly hear right now that's going to say, oh my gosh, well, that's going to be the answer? I mean, I'm curious to hear the players that are competing at certain spots. I'd be interested to know who the starting left tackle is coming out of the spring, who the starting right tackle is coming out of the spring. But for someone to say to me, like, oh, well, the offense looks a lot better, well, what the hell does that mean? Mm-hmm. To say that Donovan Peoples-Jones and Nico Collins have showed some maturation from where they were as freshman wide receivers, I don't know what that means either. I don't know what any of it means because we've been sold a bill of goods for year after year after year these last couple of years, and it just hasn't come to fruition. I think Shea Patterson's eligibility, I think who are the guys competing at the 2 tackle spots, I think the health of the team, those are the only things that I am concerned about right now. If Michigan can get through the spring without having a major injury, now we know that Tyrone Wheatley Jr. is going to miss the spring with a foot injury. But as long as it's not something that is a 9-month, 12-month injury, that's the most important thing to me. You can't have a major injury to one of your best players defensively. You can't have a major injury to Karan Higdon, I would say, on offense. But really, I don't know about you, Steve, but what could you possibly hear other than, hey, Shea Patterson has been cleared to play, that is really going to excite you until you see the product on the field on September 1st?
Well, that's my default setting, brother, when the topic comes up. I don't have any opinion until I find out if Shea Patterson is eligible or not. If he is eligible, I'll have one opinion. If he's not, then I'll probably have another. And so it all hinges to me on that. There are things I like. I like the sense of urgency in the changes made in the coaching staff. I like to hear about that because it shows me that Jimmy's just not sitting around resting on his laurels. He understands, the sense of urgency that we have right now. I like to hear that. And every new strength and conditioning coach comes in and changes things up and motivates guys. That happens at every school. You really get a true test of a strength and conditioning coach year 3, year 4. I mean, we heard this about Kelvin Torbert when he came in here with Jim originally in 2015 as well. And then Jim didn't renew his contract. So I'm not shocked to hear Ben Herbert, the new S&C, is firing guys up. We always hear that.
I tell you the one thing that going through multiple coaches over the last 10 years has really changed is how many times when a new coaching staff comes in do you hear, well, they're going to be tougher. Yeah. You hear that they're finally being coached and developed. You hear trust the coaches. You hear in the weight room, well, this team is going to be stronger and more physically fit and faster, and they're doing things with Olympic lifts and stuff like that. Every time a new coaching staff comes in, you essentially hear the same stuff over and over again in year one. And the one that really needs to go away is the idea of trust the coaches.
Yep.
That honeymoon is over with. And for me, it ended, I go back a little bit further. I think the Iowa game in 2016, but I think for everybody, that Michigan State game in 2017, that's when the honeymoon was like, all right, why am I supposed to trust these coaches? Why are they looked at as invincible? No, I mean, we're at a point now where put the damn product on the field and let's see them beat Michigan State and Ohio State on the road, beat Notre Dame, win the effing division. I mean, that's where I'm at. Win a division. Like, I was talking about winning the Big Ten title and going to college football playoff. How about you just win a division? And to do that, you have to beat your two rivals in the same season, which hasn't happened since. I mean, when is the last time they beat both rivals in the same season? It didn't happen in 2011 because they lost to Michigan State.
Right.
You have to go back to, what, 2003?
I'm going to cut myself. Is it really 2003?
I think so.
Really going back that far?
Well, because they have one win over Ohio State since 2003, right? That's 2011, and they didn't beat Michigan State that year.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah.
So they haven't beaten both rivals in the same season since 2003.
Goodbye, cruel world.
So, I mean, what are we sitting here talking about a college football playoff with Michigan or a Big Ten title? Beat your two rivals that you haven't done in the same season in 14 years and win a division, and then we can talk about something.
Well, listen, I totally believe in trust the coaches. I trust the coaches to show me this fall with what actually happens on the field, what they did this last 9 months to show me last year was a fluke. That's what that means to me. Mm-hmm. I'm not giving anybody any benefit of the doubt. There's no argument. Scoreboard doesn't win. I want to see us on the right side of the scoreboard. And that's the only evidence I really care about at this point. I'm with you. I'm tired of the fluff. I'm tired of the submarine and all that stuff. I just win, baby. That's all I want to see. The end result. That's really all I care about. Michael, it's good to see you again, brother. Thank you. Go Blue.
All right. Enjoy the weekend, gentlemen.
More Michigan podcasts in a moment. This week's Twitter poll, we asked you if this is now the greatest season of Michigan basketball since winning the 1989 national championship. Fans pretty divided. 57% said yes, 43% no. And in the replies, the most common answer for those of you that voted no was like, hey, no, I'm still going to go with 2013 because this team hasn't made it to the final game yet. And that team did and had a National Player of the Year. And that's a respectable opinion. And isn't this a fun debate to have? Aren't these the better debates? Let's debate this. Let's kill each other over which season is the greatest, not why'd we lose to Ohio State in football again? I'm tired of that debate. I'd much rather have this one. And let's close it out with our question of the week. James asks, do you think Mo Wagner returns next season? I think it's 50-50. I just looked a few days ago again, and I looked at about 4 reputable, I think is how it's actually pronounced, 4 reputable NBA draft, mock draft websites. I think 1 didn't have him getting drafted at all. 1 had him in the second round, and I think 2 had him at the bottom of the first round. So those are pretty divided opinions. Mo, you played a couple of tenacious front lines in the regional, dominated against Texas A&M, struggled mightily against Florida State. He's going on a big stage, in San Antonio. And none of those 3 teams, by the way, have really imposing front lines. Kansas has 1 really imposing force in the middle, but he's prone to foul trouble. Villanova's inside guys, those are stretch guys, much like Mo, that like to shoot a lot of threes too. So these are favorable matchups for Mo Wagner to show out. If he does, I could see him declaring without an agent and testing the draft waters again. But I think it's 50-50 he comes back. And if he does come back, I think we're the clear favorite in the Big Ten and probably a preseason top 10 team in college basketball next November. Well, thank you for watching this week's jam-packed episode of Michigan Podcast. Programming note, unless we win the national championship, no show next week. So let's hope we're doing a show next week. Go Blue.